My name again is Roberta Hill, and I am the Bioregional Coordinator for CB. And just in brief, when we talk about a bioregion, we're talking about an area, land, where systems can be fully sustained for all who live within the boundaries of that area, where there's cultural identity across the area, there's shared activities here in this part of the world. Seasons drive our activities. I don't know what, I grew up in Southern California where seasonal change was pretty bland, to say the least. And one thing I loved about this part of the world was the fact that people respond really in a very, very profound way to the changing of the season. And that's something that we all share in common. It gives us essential, we have our shared identity of like the settler colonialism, as has been mentioned here. We were the place of first contact for the settlers who came to Turtle Island. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a bioregion. What it exactly looks like, we're not sure. Conrad, when I started looking up what does our bioregion look like? What are the boundaries like? I found that there's a lot of different interpretations of that. The EPA has done extensive work on what bioregions might look like. There's groups looking at kind of the global scale, what are the bioregions that they've identified. The Acadian Northern Forest bioregion, for example, as a bioregion. I'll let you hear from Conrad in just a moment, but Conrad is affiliated with a group called Two Countries, One Forest, and they have their interpretation. Maybe you'll even be showing a map, Conrad. So that's how I found Conrad and their body of work, which is marvelous, and it's ever changing and growing, so I can't wait to hear from Conrad. And I just put it together today that I've met Megan before, Megan Hellstedt. She's going to be speaking about food systems. And it was until I saw her face here today that I recognized that we have met before, and we met at Bumbleroot. And we were on the same farm tour together. And we talked at the time, we just kind of like came together and talked about her work, my work, and that she should really check out CB. And so here she is. So these connections are really, really profound. And then John, I haven't known John personally long at all, but he was amongst the founding advisors, board of advisors on the board of advisors for CB. And Scott told me that it was John who kind of brought to the organization. It's one thing to kind of come together around this work and these ideas, but you really have to put stuff on the ground. You got to do projects. You got to actually get some stuff done. And so that became CB's really guiding star. And
that was your fault, John?
I don't remember saying that.
But also, Scott said he loves the fact that John had Lorax in his email handle. So he's a tree guy, and John is now with the Nature Conservancy, working both in this country and in Canada on this really high-level forestry and how do we grow forests that are actually also solving the poly crisis. Okay, so I think this is going to be just a really interesting, important conversation. It is going to be a conversation that each member of the panel is going to have a chance to present the work that they're working on, and then we'll have a chance just to have a conversation about that. And I'm hoping it will seem mostly like a conversation rather than a moderated discussion. That's my hope for this. Okay, so we're going to start with Conrad Reining, and here we go.
Or can I use?
Oh, yeah, there
can
you
you all
go.
hear me?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Roberta. It's really a great honor to be here, and thanks to also to CB for the opportunity. So my name is Conrad Reining.
Could you speak up just a bit for those of us in the back?
Yep.
Turn it up.
The microphone is back there.
How about now?
Wonderful.
Better? All right. So my name's Conrad Reining. I work at Dartmouth now with in the sort of this intersection between communications and development. But my real sort of training and background is with conservation. I started my work in Latin America, primarily in Guatemala, and then I moved to this area in the 1990s in Vermont. It's where I live now, and I've worked in kind of large-scale conservation since then. I sit now on a couple of boards, an executive committee as well that operate in these realms that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. But what I want to do here is to kind of talk about large-scale conservation and kind of how does it all tie in with bioregionalism, and see what all the other folks here have to say and all of you have to say about that as well, and just sort of see what are those connections. And as you'll see, connectivity is a kind of a major theme in all of this. The focus here, at least for me, is in this what folks call the Northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion. It stretches from the Tug Hill Plateau. This has been defined out by different groups. This is a map that actually comes from the Nature Conservancy. Thank you. The Nature Conservancy has helped produce a lot of these maps on here too, particularly Nature Conservancy of Maine. So a big shout out as well to Dan Coker with them. And so this is an area that runs from the Tug Hill and the Adirondacks through Vermont, New Hampshire, most of Maine, not quite the southernmost part of Maine, into essentially all of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and a bit of Quebec, essentially all the Quebec south of the St. Lawrence, about 80-some million acres, size of Germany. And so it's an area that is, roughly speaking, a sort of similar in terms of its forest types, its vegetation types, and so on. So it's been sort of classified as an ecoregion. We are roughly here. I kind of placed the star as best I could, but so I think this area here is very much in the center of this important, globally important ecoregion, as I'll get to in a minute. So I'm on the board of two groups and on the executive committee of another. They have sort of similar kind of overlapping missions, all around different sort of flavors of large-scale conservation. Two Countries, One Forest focuses on this region, this bioregion, and on the protecting, restoring the natural heritage of this region. It's been around for about 20 years or so. I helped to start it back in the early 2000s, and it's small, but we're trying to kind of keep the message out there. I'm also on the board of Wildlands Network, which has a much bigger sort of charge or mission. It's a sort of a continental scale conservation mission, and the Wildlands Network and Two Countries, One Forest are working up as sort of a strategic partnership that we're going to talk more about, that you'll hear more about over the course of this year and next as we sort of get things sorted out. Also on the executive committee of the Staying Connected initiative, which is again, I'll talk a little bit more about it and what it's really up to, but it's very much about making the connections between big forest blocks in this region. So to set a bit of context here, we're in a broadleaf, deciduous, mixed forest, right? This is a forest that used to be across the globe in these various spaces. Over time, it's diminished quite a lot due to all kinds of things. This is prime agricultural land, prime territory, and so over millennia it has shrunk down. But there are still a few big pockets, including this area. And so this region here is one of the largest intact, broadly temperate mixed forests in the world. It's globally important. And this again, thank you to the Nature Conservancy. This is sort of a zooming in a bit further, looking at so-called well-connected forests in the Northeast, or Mid-Atlantic to Northeast. So these are forests where there's good internal connectivity. They're relatively intact. And so that's what you see. And as you can see, as we move north up into this region, those forest blocks get bigger. Again, this region is important globally, and it's important within North America. It's important globally. So what we do here has these broad ramifications. And you can see then this is the sort of the kind of theoretical or ideal kind of connectivity that would occur among all of these different big blocks. And that connectivity extends out into Canada, to areas far to our north, boreal regions and so on, and to the south. And in fact, the group that I'm, the Wildlands Network, has kind of expanded this whole vision to include not just these northern forests here, but also areas down into Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and so on. You know, thinking about what would a connected, resilient network of conservation lands look like in North America, or in northeastern or in eastern North America. So coming back to this image, I think what's important is you can see, I don't know how well you can see it, there's sort of the darker patches in the Adirondacks and in northern New Hampshire and so on. Those are conserved forests. And one of the things about this region is that the conserved areas are kind of concentrated. They're concentrated in places like the Adirondacks, in the White Mountains. Maine has got some good stuff in Baxter, and so on, some places in Nova Scotia. But again, they're sort of concentrated. One of the big challenges we have is adding more conserved lands that are outside of these kind of really concentrated places, so that we have those connectivities, those big stepping stones, those blocks, where species can move, where evolution can occur, particularly in the face of climate change. And so one of the groups, the Staying Connected Initiative, has really been looking closely at what are those big kind of linkages among those big forest blocks. And you can see that there are several here. I think I count, basically 9 or so. And we could go into more detail about what they all are. But I think what's important is there's one here that runs from essentially northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire, western Maine, a bit up into Quebec as well, that is just a little bit north of here. And that is a vitally important connection between the boreal and subboreal regions of places like the Gaspé, right on down the Appalachians to the south. And it is this area of flow that makes this area that we're surrounded by so vital, I think, in terms of continental conservation. This is sort of zooming in. This is a map from the Wildlands Network, sort of zooming in a little bit more about what might, a fully sort of envisioned, built out, a set of conservation lands look like. And so you can see this big blob in western Maine, how important these lands are to essentially anchors of conservation, where the green, the lighter green, are the sort of is the connectivity among these things. And there's been a lot of conservation mapping that's happened over the years here, and a lot of these maps are available at a very granular level, and can help guide things like renewables, and where are you going to put a big solar farm? What are you going to, where's the, if we have to build new transmission lines, where could they go in a way that's not going to, affect connectivity or potential connectivity? So these things really can help us as we go. And in addition to, I've also been involved with an entity called Future Forests Reimagined, which is saying, okay, we've got this really heavily forested landscape. It's a landscape that has come back into forest, as many of you know. 100 years ago or 50 years ago, there's a lot of this was deforested. It's come back in. We've got these forests here, but these also, we know that most of these forests are in private lands. Many of them are in private lands, and many of them are actively managed. How can we up the game with that active management? How can we help move that active management so that the forests we're ending up with are older, more diverse? And there's been a lot of great forestry research that's gone on. A lot of good academic forestry is happening out there that's saying we can continue to manage forests for a whole suite of forest products while moving. It was just like Steve was talking about in Wisconsin with the indigenous people in Wisconsin, how they have managed to up the amount of board feet that are on their land while continuing to produce. That kind of thing can happen here too. And so the idea then is to move the needle in terms of active forest management, then also to identify those places that are
still old, there's not a lot of it, but a few of the old, what's left of the old forest, get those strictly protected, and then find those other places. The third leg, is find what are those other places that should be completely protected as well. So you have this kind of, this tripod. You have protecting what's currently old, identifying that and protecting it. There's just little scraps that are left. Then what are the good candidates to become old and left to be, say, as wilderness areas or parks? And then the vast majority is still going to be actively managed. How do we move the needle on that active management so that you end up with forests that are more diverse, store more carbon? John's going to talk a lot more about that, I imagine. And help us reach our biodiversity and carbon goals as well, while fulfilling our societal needs for wood products, for forest products. And so that's basically my quick overview, and hope that will help to get us launched here. And thanks.
All right, testing. Okay. All right, well, this is a little different for me. So I'm usually in a windowless room with a PowerPoint, pictures and figures and arrows and a paragraph on the back of each one, talking about data and p-values and r-squareds and things. So I'm going to try something a little bit different today, since we're outside and having a little different conversation where science plays a role, but as we know, it's about a lot more than that, and community in particular. So I'm going to take you on a little journey. I'm going to start out with some positive things that get me excited and make me optimistic and hopeful. And then I'm going to take you down to a dark place where I've been recently as I reflect on some work that I've been involved with over the last 30 years. And I'm going to try to dig out of that and come back with some hope and optimism. So hold me to that. If I don't come back to the optimism, you gotta bring me out of the depths here. And part of my brain is reeling a bit as well from the sessions this morning here, and I've been trying to reframe some of what I plan to talk about, and we'll see if that comes out as tangents that lead us astray, or if there's some cohesiveness. So I've been with the Nature Conservancy in the North America region here now for just about 2 years, and my role as the North American Carbon Science Director, which is a role I'm excited about, because it's sort of the culmination of really a lot of what I've been working on for the last 30 years. And I'm fortunate because my team is tasked with supporting all the state chapters within the Nature Conservancy and an organization called Nature United in Canada, which is our affiliate in Canada, because there was apparently already a Nature Conservancy of Canada. Anyway, so I have a team of PhD, really bright young scientists working for me. They're bringing all kinds of amazing tools like machine learning and that dreaded artificial intelligence, which are really just fancy ways of using statistics to look at patterns from big data. And we're fortunate that we do live in a time where we do have a lot of data coming in that we can turn into information that can help us make decisions. And so a big part of the role of my team is to help the state chapters make decisions around the Nature Conservancy's 2030 goals. So like a lot of organizations and nations, the organization is very focused on where we are in terms of emissions and CO2 concentrations by 2030. And so we've really latched on to this idea that there are natural climate solutions. So fancy way of using photosynthesis, and maybe when we talk about carbon, I don't know if you think of it this way, but photosynthesis is really grabbing the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting it into the trees and the roots and the soil, and that's, so when we talk about carbon, it's really a surrogate for thinking about photosynthesis and that process. And so natural climate solutions are really a way of just trying to leverage photosynthesis to our benefit in terms of keeping CO2 from going into the atmosphere when it shouldn't, and having it come into the natural systems when it should. And so some examples of that, of work that my team is involved with. So since we work across North America, the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, which was land that was all floodplain forest for a long time and was cleared and had very rich soils, and so we've been planting things in that floodplain for many, many years. Now, as you know, with more frequent flooding, as we heard from Signature Mimi earlier, it makes it real challenging for many, for many populations and communities in that region to actually grow food, and any given year, more often than not, the crops fail, and so many of these are communities that don't have a lot of other options, and so we're working to restore those floodplain forests and leveraging carbon market dollars to actually help get trees in the ground and restore those systems functioning in those floodplains. Some other work of restoration, so I work with teams in the southeast US that are restoring millions of acres of longleaf pine ecosystems, which was a natural forest system there that is actually well suited to the future climate with more frequent drought and frequent fires. This is a system that's much better adapted than the loblolly pine that's being planted there on a commercial basis. And so we help do the math on figuring out what those benefits are and the timing of those benefits. More closer to home, as we look at the forests in the Central Appalachians and throughout the Northeast here, we're dealing with the legacy of a lot of poor decisions in terms of harvesting. Also in the Central Appalachians, a history of mining that completely cleared out these lands in our backyards. Here, we have a history of 200 years ago or so. Most of this forest was cleared. If you've ever read any Tom Wessel's books, Reading the Forest and Landscape, you can sort of understand that history and see rock walls and see the kind of that legacy. That legacy has come through to today with repeated harvesting, sometimes with an intent for the future, but more often than not without an intent for the future. And so I guess on my good news part is I've only been with the Nature Conservancy a couple of years, but I continue to be amazed at the quality and the intelligence of the people that I work with and the passion that they have for doing this work on the ground, not just all across North America, but all around the world. And so that's what gives me hope and gets me fired up, and why would I enjoy logging into my Zooms every day to help support. The downside, early in my career, so I did a degree in wildlife management from the University of Maine, go Black Bears, and at that time I realized that if I cared about wildlife and wanted to be in the north, that I better learn something about forestry. I couldn't give the wildlife up completely, so I started working. The only real skills that I had were to actually identify all the songbirds by sight and sound in the region. So we got red-eyed vireos, there's common yellowthroat, American redstart. So it's a curse. It's a curse. You don't want to watch any Netflix movies with me. It's not good. So I started getting work for the summer, counting birds and measuring trees up in northern Maine, so north of Greenville and outside of Ashland, and then later on for graduate work up in northern New Brunswick. So similar Canadian forest, 2 countries, 1 forest, same birds, same trees. So I probably, between 1991 and 98, I spent probably 6 of those summers every day being chewed up by black flies and getting my shins bruised by stumps and logs. And so I learned a lot about birds. I learned a lot about forestry in what we think of as the industrial forest. And I was convinced that there was a better way to do things, that we could still have these things that we wanted, whether they're birds and lumber from our backyard and paper and other products, that we have the ability to get these materials locally and not put the burden, as Steve was talking about, on the Congo and other places, that we can do these things locally. And so I was involved with a bunch of research in the early 90s, and then went on to continue to do research, try to figure out some of the, maybe some of the work that Conrad mentioned, trying to figure out, how do we do these things better? How do we balance all these needs? And spend a lot of time kind of at professional forestry meetings talking about things that most of that crowd didn't want to hear. They all looked like me, old white guys with gray beards. They still do, unfortunately. That's changing a little bit. That'll be the optimism I come back to. So flash forward here now, here we are 30 years later. Myself and a few others who were involved with that work 30 years ago cobbled together some grants to actually go back out in that landscape and try to understand what's happening, what's changed. Again, Steve mentioned the billion bird study and this significant decline of birds globally, and we're seeing it here regionally and in Maine as well. And so we had data from before, and we wanted to get some data from after to try to figure out what's going on. So in that time since then, so the early 90s, if you were around Maine then, we're at the tail end of this spruce budworm outbreak, which really instigated the building of many miles of roads throughout that industrial forest to get access to the spruce and fir that were being consumed by the spruce budworm, which is a native insect that comes around and cycles around every 40 years. So, but the practices at the time were pretty large, extensive clear cuts that were partly in the name of salvaging, partly in the name of reestablishing those forests. And so, we didn't find too many smoking guns at that time, other than that there wasn't much old forest around, and so we were curious what was happening given what we're seeing globally here, and we fully anticipated that numbers of birds up there were continuing to decline. The upside is that generally, a lot of the birds that we were interested in have actually increased in their abundance on these lands. And so part of the reason is that, and this is sort of maybe an unintended consequence of some of the ban clear-cutting referenda that happened in the late 90s and around 2000, is that clear-cutting as a practice became more difficult to do. It was still allowed, but there were some administrative hurdles to do it. And so the landowners and the logging companies up there moved to a system of what's called partial harvesting, which it's not in the textbooks. It's really simply a way of removing volume. And almost overnight, in the North Woods of Maine, which is about 17 million acres of forest land, we went from about 250,000 acres a year being harvested to 500,000 acres a year being harvested, same volume. So we dispersed that impact over a much larger area. And so the consequence has been this messier forest that doesn't necessarily look like anything that we resemble, that we remember from the past. And so the discouraging part of what I found is that if you were managing these forests for commercial timber, for the long run value of forest products, we haven't done a very good job. We found the average diameter of the trees are lower. The density of trees are lower. The wrong species are more abundant if you were really focused on value. And so we've lost in the landscape. We looked at 80% of the mature softwood forest and 60% of the mature hardwood forest, and all that's left is really on the public lands up there. So as someone who spent the last 30 years trying to write papers and do research on the right way that I thought we should do these things, it's not getting translated to the ground. And so that's my despair and reflection of 30 years of work. Coming back to the positive side, my family and I just recently moved back to the Oxford Hills here at Norway Center, right over here. Yay! Yes, and part of the reason is because of this community and things like this. Thank you. And so we've restored an old farmhouse and are getting to know a little piece of land. And so I have a little 3/4 mile loop that I do every day, sometimes twice a day with my dog, and there's a little 4-acre patch of woods, and because of who I am, I know all the birds that are there, I know all the plants that are there. But and this little 4 acres really represents the same kind of trajectory that much of this land has been on. There's evidence, there's rock walls and barbed wire fence, and so there were pasture and likely sheep there, and then over the years after World War II, when most of the men went away and a lot of forests came back, there's been a bunch of harvesting since then, sort of random picking of different trees, and so I can see the story in the stumps there of kind of really no regard for what that future forest looks like. But the bright side is that there are 15 species of trees out there, and some of them are going to be winners and some are going to be losers in this future. For example, there's a lot of white ash out there, and things don't look good for white ash. But I guess the bottom line for me is that we live in a place with inherently diverse forests and natural communities, and I think inherently resilient, and we have an opportunity, and we know how to do these things. We need the right incentives and the right framework to get them done. So I'll stop babbling now, but thank you.
All right, so before I get started, I'm going to ask people to stand up because the first part's a tiny bit interactive. So stretch your legs, let your lunch sink down another level. All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talking about food in the bioregional context without getting my props to fall over. There we go. So before I dive in, I want to do a quick sort of call and response, or question and response. I'll say something, you think of the first word that comes to mind, and I'll ask you just to shout. I want to hear from a bunch of you. So the first question is, what's one word you think of when I say food?
Chocolate.
Cookies, eat, hunger, pollinators, local, soil.
Honey.
Honey? Did I hear that right?
Honey.
Honey, cook, fresh,
Rose.
grows, okay. Snacks, even better. Somebody didn't have enough lunch. Okay, second question. What do you think of when I say sustainable food? Local, kale, fruits and vegetables, organic, small farmers, seasonal, compost,
Greenhouse.
soil, greenhouse, local, good, biodiversity, nutrition, great, neighbors.
Perennial.
What was that? Did I hear something over there? Homegrown, okay, great. Less consumption. Okay, you guys are all over the sustainable food side. Great, so shake your limbs and then have a seat, and we'll keep going here. So my point with that exercise is to dive in on the first part of my talk of how we use language around food. So there was different language, and did you notice a difference in the two exercises, or in what was going through your head with the two questions? So I heard some differences. There's some similarities came up on both sides, which is good.
Sustainable was healthier.
Sustainable was healthier. So we've created, and we're all sort of part of it, and in the system we've created a division between food and sustainable food. And when we do that, it allows food to pollute the water, pollute the planet, contribute to climate change, harm our health. So that we sort of feel that we have no choice, but most of food really isn't sustaining us or sustaining the planet. And then there's this little bit of food over here, and if we look at some proxy statistics, it's about, say, 6% of sales of food in the US are organic. I just use organic as one of the potential proxies for sustainable. So we've got some food over here that does sustain us and the planet, or at least maybe we think it does, but we're not totally sure. So this is my first prop. I don't know if you can read it all the way in the back. I tried to draw really big, But these are some words that come up when we talk about sustainable food. And so I'll take local. Local came up a couple times about food and sustainable food. What do we mean by local? Often grown within, I don't know, maybe 10 miles, maybe 100 miles. We can debate how far the line should be. The foods that we're eating that are local. So if I go to the farmer's market and buy local food here, I might buy local carrots. Well, carrots are from Western Europe and Western Asia and Northern Africa. That's where their origins are. I might buy local apples in the fall. Well, apples originated from Kazakhstan and were brought by the Romans to England, and the English brought them here through colonization. And so we're buying, and I might buy local dairy and I might buy local meat. But none of that actually comes from this place. Or not much of it, I shouldn't say none. There is some, but a lot of it doesn't. So we're a little confused maybe on what exactly we mean by local. And then we have other terms. I put just a few here. I could have had a really long list, but I'm trying to stick within my time limit. Fair trade is one. So here's a term. You can get a stamp on products you buy in the store and say, these are fair trade. And usually it's products from the global south. And fair trade means that someone somewhere in the supply chain was maybe paid a living wage and hopefully treated without sort of human rights abuses. And then we pay a little extra for that because it's good value food and the people were treated well and we feel maybe we can trust that food even though we're not totally sure. But then for food sold from our own country, it doesn't come from a fair trade label. We don't really know how were people treated in the supply chain. Was there a living wage at the base? Were human rights abuses stopped? And in a lot of cases not. Even if in our own backyards, there's a lot of stuff happening that we wouldn't feel comfortable with if we really knew what was going on behind the food that we eat. So another one, recyclable. So to bring in packaging as an example, we think, oh, well, I want to be sustainable. Should I buy paper? Should I buy plastic, which is better, which has a lighter footprint? If I buy paper and it's not from a sustainable forest, is that okay? If I buy plastic and I can recycle it, is that better? Who knows? It's a lot of confusion. And then the last, there are more and more new things coming up to try to distinguish the sustainable food, so carbon neutral being one of the latest. So what does carbon neutral mean? If a product has carbon neutral on the packaging, it means that the company that produced the food is producing greenhouse gas emissions, and then they're doing something else to try to sink those, maybe in a forest, maybe in a forestry restoration project in Thailand or something. And so they're able to balance their numbers and say this product is carbon neutral, so we feel good about buying it. And again, the price tag goes up. So this is all to say, and I think none of this is news to you guys. There's a lot of confusion around what is sustainable in food, and this division between food and sustainable food has allowed us to compartmentalize sustainable food as expensive, inaccessible, elitist, and at best confusing, because nobody really knows, even those who work in food day in and day out, nobody really knows how to get to food that sustains us and our planet. Didn't plan a spot for my props. All right, so now we're going to lift up to the systems level. So we were just talking about food products as individuals and how we face decisions. If we look at the food system, so again, none of this is rocket science and won't be new to you guys, but how do we get the food that we have? So it gets grown, right? The vegetables or the animals, whatever gets grown. They then go somewhere to be processed, maybe as a fresh product that's packaged, or maybe mixed together into a pizza or some sort of ready meal. Gets transported, sometimes thousands of miles, sometimes tens of miles, goes to some place where we can buy it, so some sort of seller, which might be in place or might be online. Then we eat it, and then there's the waste cycle. And in a really good scenario for this system, some of this waste gets back into the nutrient cycle through composting or anaerobic digestion or other things. So this is how our food gets made and gets to our plates. And why do we have this system? Well, the system was designed essentially to provide cheap calories, right? And so it was designed to get as much food to as many people without spoiling as possible. So the food we're getting is only really from a few key commodities. Our diets are really well grounded in corn and soy right now, and not a whole diversity of other things. And it's designed for speed, it's designed for low cost, at the consumer end, and it's designed for good shelf life. So that's how our food comes to us. And what has this caused if we think of the impact? So this system that we're working with has caused a whole lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture and food systems. Some of that's methane, some of it's carbon dioxide from the processes, refrigeration, transport, all of that's mixed in. It's caused inequality. You have a real imbalance of where power and wealth sit in this food system, and there's a lot more power and wealth in the processing, transporting, and selling of food than there is in the growing of food. You have a lot of issues with our own health, humanity, so we have a lot of, speaking for America here as our home base, a lot of non-communicable diseases that are linked to diet, diabetes, heart disease, the list goes on, cancers that are really closely related to how we eat and what's in what we eat. And Steve brought up some really good points this morning on that. And the other piece of the people side of it is you have insecurity. So in Maine, I think the latest numbers are about 13% of people in Maine don't get enough food. They experience food insecurity. And then at this end of the system, what are we dealing with in the US? 30 to 40% of the food that's supplied never actually gets eaten. So you have all of, this is the system we're all participating in. I think a lot of us try to do something better. This is kind of how it's designed, and it's hard to get away from all of these impacts. So I spent 15 years working in the food industry trying to tweak, can we make our waste less? Can we make our packaging less? Can we reduce emissions at the agricultural level? And it's a bear. Like, this is a nasty system that's kind of broken, and trying to fix it is really tough. So this is the optimistic part. Didn't warn you that was coming, but what I want to present here is a way to reframe it, possible reframing. So kind of put that picture out of your mind, and let's imagine together for a moment if we could have a different type of food system, and we'll use the bioregional context as an example. And so this is concept I stole from a woman from UNESCO who was giving a wonderful webinar I participated in a couple of years ago, and she said, food exists at the crossroads of nature and culture. So this is how humanity has survived for thousands of years, right? This is how people ate. We ate from where we lived, we ate from the ecosystems that we were part of, and we knew that destroying those ecosystems would, had an immense and immediate detrimental impact on ourselves. And we ate based on our cultural traditions and how our cultures had evolved. So if we think of this, and we think of the bioregion we sit in, what might a food system look like if it was more rooted in nature and culture? Because I'll argue, and you can feel free to argue back with me, I'm happy to do that. The system we have now is a little bit of both and really neither. So it's not there. And so if we were to redesign it, we'd look at the nature we have, we'd look at the cultural diversity we have in this region, and we'd understand also the impacts of colonialism. They've changed the nature in this bioregion, and they've changed the people and the dynamics and the culture in this region. And we have incoming climate migration as well, which will add a whole other dimension to the cultural diversity that we have in the Northeast. And so I think here we have an opportunity to reframe how we eat, think about it differently, and support systems that bring our food and ourselves closer to nature and closer to culture, so that our food is actually sustaining us and sustaining the planet. So lastly, I'll try to be quick. Thank you. How do we get there? Is I didn't want to give all that like sort of idealistic stuff without maybe a roadmap. So with a quick talk of tipping points, there were lots of mentions of tipping points yesterday. So I'll envision we're kind of here, like we do have a lot of great stuff happening in Maine and in the Northeast around doing food differently and grounding it more in nature and grounding it more in culture. But we're still pushing the boulder up the hill. We haven't hit the tipping point because the mainstream American consumer cannot eat that way today. And there are a couple of barriers I want to call out. So I think if we can tackle these barriers, then maybe we'll get to the downslope side of the hill. So the first one is perception, and that's back to what I was talking about at the beginning, changing our language, how we talk about food. And we have to get to the point we're talking about food. We need food we can trust. We need food that sustains us and the planet. And we have to stop talking about all the sort of gibberish and the language that gets us confused and frankly doesn't really move us very, very far forward. So that's the first one. The next one is cost. So the reality is that most people today cannot afford to eat the closest thing we have to sustainable food. And so that has to change. We have to have more food that's affordable. We have to have more food that's free, frankly. I mean, food is a basic human right. How can people not have access to it? So we have to tackle the cost piece in a way that's real for where people are today. The third one, and I think this is the biggest one, is time. Because to do food well, to engage with food and with nature, you have to take time. You have to grow food, you have to share with others, you have to cook, you have to prepare, you have to learn. And our workplaces and our school system don't provide time for that. So I would say in those two places, in how we educate children and in how we employ adults, we have a huge opportunity to make more time for food and to give people more time for food. In the school curriculum directly, time to eat, time to prepare. Food is just as important as geometry. There's a lot of geometry you can learn in food as well. It's a very interdisciplinary topic. And for workplaces to really give people time, not just, on your vacation, maybe you can go, sit on an organic farm and learn something, but how do you do it day to day in your life through your workplace? And the last hurdle being knowledge. I think if we get to all of those places where people have time, where the prices are more accessible, then we just have to share a lot of knowledge. So we have to get we've lost a lot of knowledge generationally, whether it was through colonialism in the last 400 years in this country, but also I'd say the last couple generations since the industrialization of food since World War II. Things my grandmother knew how to do were lost because, opening a can of Spam was a lot easier than cooking liver and onions. And so I don't know how to cook liver and onions, and maybe I don't want to know how, but it might be helpful. So I think that's the last piece, is sharing food, bringing people together, and helping that sort of the knowledge within the bioregion learn. So there you have it.
So I'm going to kick off the conversation, trying to pull some threads together here. So one thing that came through in all three talks is that the solutions are known. The solutions, there will certainly be challenges, but it seems that they're going to lead to more time, more joy, more birds singing. So I think that is really important. The idea of John Gunn, who can't even remember saying it, but said, the work has to be done on the ground, get some projects done. I'm thinking if we, to move forward on, doing a better job with our forests and our food system, bioregionally, we've got to just start moving forward on this work. And as an educator, I'm always interested in the role that education plays in these kinds of large transformations. And all of you spoke with a lot of passion about the work that you're doing. And I'm really curious to know, and especially for younger people that are here with us today, and as we move forward teaching younger people, what were the experiences that caught you early on that kind of got you thinking in this direction of that has landed you where you are today, basically? I just want to, if that's a kind of a rambling thing, but I just want to try to pull all these pieces that you have brought here back to, like, what's the origin story for you? Or what do you think? Like, what were the experiences? And we'll start with you, Conrad.
I can think of two. One, so I grew up in Washington, D.C., but my dad would take me out to the wildlife refuges in around in the mid-Atlantic. There was one place in particular in a place called Blackwater, National Wildlife Refuge on the eastern shore of Maryland. And there you can climb up a fire tower and look out over these big wetlands there. This is a time when, and this is the 70s, right, when a lot of species were still recovering from DET and other things like that. So things like bald eagles were really rare, but they were there. And we would go out there and the chance of maybe seeing a bald eagle. And now where I live in the upper valley of Vermont and New Hampshire, they're everywhere now, actually. Well, not everywhere, but they're pretty common now. But back then they weren't. And so that really left doing that got me very excited, and the wonder of that world really took hold. And then second thing that happened was I started off in college. Early in college, I started off in the engineering track, which was great. And then there was this sort of traveling road show that came through as World Wildlife Fund, and they showed this amazing movie. And Prince Philip was there in the sort of entourage that kind of gave this kind of rousing talk. And at the end of it, I was like, "Yep, okay, I'm gonna just." It's like a switch was flipped, and I said, "Okay, I'm gonna just switch my major. I'm gonna go into the environmental stuff." And it was both like a wake up call, like they were talking about tropical forests in particular, and how dire the situation was. So this is early 80s at this point, and yet the opportunities are there to try to find some solutions here. So it's this combination, I think, of urgency, threat, problem, but there are some solutions out there. And it strikes me as CB is a place that's sort of like a doing. I've heard this now in several instances of very much a doing, getting things done, start, these tangible projects. And it feels to me like this kind of thing is the model we should be looking for, with lots and lots of replicants around. So you're doing this in all of these different areas, getting it all done, sharing stories and so on. But that will move the needle, actually, and very sustainably too. So.
Sure. So one story from when I was young that stands out. I grew up in Iowa. For those of you who don't know it, it's mostly corn and pigs. There's some other cool stuff there, but what I grew up noticing and smelling was the big hog farms. So if the wind was blowing the right way, I lived in a city, but at the edge of the city, and you'd smell what was going on. And when you're driving down the highway, you'd see these just fields and fields of hogs all packed in these buildings and mud, and the smell of it was just inhumane. And then for school tours, we'd go tour the stockyards. Our town's stockyards were at one time bigger than Chicago. I don't remember when, but back in the day, they were really big. And everyone was proud of how we sort of fed all these hogs and cattle through the stockyards to go to market. And every night, the futures report on the news was about the price of hogs and the price of corn and the price of soy and da-da-da-da. And it never made any sense to me, any of it. The fact that was how we grew animals, or that was how we grew corn, or that was how we slaughtered animals, that's how we ate animals. So I became a vegetarian. And my best solution at the time was asking McDonald's to leave the meat off of my cheeseburger, which was also not very sustainable. So that was my very first attempt at how could I change things? And I think there's a lot more to do.
Wow. So Megan, I was born in Iowa. Grew up outside of St. Paul, Minnesota. And when I was a kid, my mom was a volunteer at a city zoo called Como Zoo in St. Paul. And in the 70s was the early days of captive breeding in zoos. And so early childhood experiences, bottle feeding Siberian tigers and changing orangutan diapers, made me aware of habitat loss and endangered species in a way that maybe most kids in St. Paul didn't have an awareness. And that's sort of what set me on this sort of wildlife management career for those of a certain age. I wanted to be Marlin Perkins You know who Marlon Perkins is? Yeah. So, yeah. So I got to be Marlon for a little while. I drove around the Serengeti in a Land Rover and lived in Tanzania in the Peace Corps for a couple of years and had all these amazing experience with wildlife there, but realized that I wasn't imprinted on that landscape, that the forests of places like northern Minnesota and Maine were what I cared about, and so I did not pursue my glamorous life of an international wildlife biologist and came back to the Northeast. So.
Well, it's great. I just, again, as an educator, what comes through there is you had experiences that grabbed you by the heart and that led you in a direction. And I think that if we're going to solve these problems, we've got to think of how to provide our children with as many of those opportunities to be grabbed by the heart and to have experience trying to figure out and solve the problems on the ground, and just to get some experience at doing that at an early age when they can have some help. So yeah, that's really beautiful. Also, I wanted to ask you about just at the bioregional scale. You mentioned, Megan, in your talk that you know, the system between if we had a system that lied at that intersection for food between culture and nature. Yeah, if we had such a system across our bioregion, like what would that look like? So I guess my question for all of you is, in the work that you're doing now on the ground, what do you see as like one of the major benefits of organizing ourselves at the bioregional scale? What can we do if we organize ourselves at the bioregional scale that we simply can't do within the boundaries of our own communities as much as we may wish to try, or even trying to tackle it at the global scale, that sweet spot of the bioregional scale? What would be the things in your, we can start this way and go that way this time if you'd like. Okay, so.
Great question.
You know, I think I see some of the things that go on around here, the Sebago Clean Waters program, which you know a lot about. I think making tangible connections to outcomes, whether it's something like protecting land in a watershed and it's making its linkage to clean water. I think those kinds of projects and activities are maybe more likely to gain traction than more dispersed kind of abstract kinds of things. So the more you can tie, even if what you're doing is part of that bigger work, I think the more tying it to community and local benefits in that way, I think is important.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, John. It's more tangible, more human scale. Certainly easier to tackle than the big global mess that's way too big. And the town level is kind of arbitrary, and humans weren't designed to exist within sort of geopolitical boundaries. We were designed to exist in ecosystems and much bigger than just a town or a couple of towns. So I think it feels like it fits the human scale, and I think it invites us to think differently about what we do every day, how we eat, how we build our houses, how we clothe ourselves, all these things. If we think of them in a bioregional context and to challenge ourselves, what would it look like if we relied on our bioregion and were sort of invested in our bioregion with our fellow species to provide those basic things we need? I think it's a framework that's small enough that we could kind of put our heads around. And I think, when I'm thinking about food, and I'd love to talk, Conrad and John, about, what if forests weren't just for forestry and timber products? What if we got to the point of thinking of the multifaceted values in forests and how we interact with them as humans? Would that bring us to a different way of managing forests, for example?
That's the next question. Go ahead, Matt.
I would love to. Okay, I mean, I actually did my master's degree on non-timber forest products. So in Latin America. So the thing about the Maya tropical forests. These are the forests in northern Guatemala, southern Mexico. They were heavily occupied. I mean, there were a lot of people who lived in those forests 2,000 years ago, and then there was sort of a societal collapse, and a lot of the forests came back. but there was a botanical imprint on those forests from the populations that had been there before. And so you saw essentially there's essentially greater densities of certain kinds of species that I think were useful to people 2,000 years ago. So those species are things like allspice, which is something we use every day. And so there was a trade in allspice, but wild allspice from the forests of Central America. And same thing with a tree called chico zapote, which is a latex. And now I'm not sure if the Maya used the latex, but the chiclets, that's the original chewing gum base was latex. It was harvested natural latex, right? Harvested from these trees in large quantities in Central America until there were the chemical synthetics were developed probably post-war. And so you had essentially whole communities that grew up around harvesting those things without cutting forests. And there was an anthropologist wrote a book called Forest Society, in fact, about those forest societies that lived very sustainably in those forests. And it was only after, really in the 60s and 70s, that things started to change and started to get lumbering operations, things like that changed. The forest opened up the forest through roads and stuff like that. But the Forest Society kind of gets at this, that when I was working there, one of the things we did was I worked with a couple of anthropologists, an American and then a student of his who was Guatemalan. And we then tried to figure out how can we go back and start to work with the local people and kind of reestablish some of these systems in the face of some of the challenges that they were facing from the outside. And that seemed to work. I mean, it really did work to work on things like agroforestry systems. There's some really amazing agroforestry systems there too. And again, there are these cultures, and there's the people who are living in these areas, there was not a real culture of doing, say, heavy-duty logging. They wanted to take out very small amounts of wood for, essentially just beyond sort of a subsistence scale, but not, large scale harvesting. And that was just a social mindset. And by working with that, you can really then start to tie in a lot of your biodiversity goals too. The other thing too, I just wanted to mention too, just about this region, that map I showed you, the Northern Appalachian Acadian region, is like 90% congruent with Wabanaki too. So if you think about, imagine many of you have seen the maps of the Wabanaki homeland. It's really close. There's this really big overlap, and so I think there are all the opportunities here then to tap into that incredible indigenous knowledge that's there, and how is that going to inform all of our forestry practices, food practices, and other things like this. There's been some really great stuff that's been happening in Nova Scotia with kind of a really strong resurgence of Wabanaki wisdom. It's something called two-eyed seeing. Some of you may have heard this, bringing Western science and traditional knowledge together. And so, I'm babbling on here, but it'd be fun to talk more about it all.
And we do have to, I guess we have to wrap it up. And we've gone a little over our time. And unfortunately, I didn't even get to the audience question part, so I'm sorry about that. But these people are here, so I think we should try to continue this discussion. We could pull up some chairs somewhere and grab one of these people and let's ask some questions. And I think this is a wonderful discussion. I don't know if you had any, I guess we don't even have time for parting words, but thank you all so much for joining us.
Quick rundown on the rest of the afternoon. So you have a couple minutes break, and then we're going to go into our workshops, and our workshops are